The wind came down the mountain like a living thing, clawing at the pines and howling through the narrow pass. Snow followed it in thick, blinding sheets, erasing the trail almost as soon as it was made. Elias Boone stood at the edge of his cabin porch, his rifle resting against the log wall, eyes narrowed as he scanned the white chaos. He had lived alone in these mountains for 12 years, long enough to read the weather the way other men read books. This storm was no passing squall. It was a killer. He was turning back inside when he saw movement near the treeline. Two shapes, hunched and staggering, fought their way uphill. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. No one traveled this high, not in winter, not with night closing in. But they kept coming, slipping, falling, dragging themselves back up again. Elias swore under his breath and stepped off the porch. By the time they reached the clearing, both women collapsed into the snow as if their legs had simply given up. He knelt beside them, rough hands surprisingly gentle as he checked for signs of life. They were breathing, shallow and fast, faces pale beneath windburn and frost. "Hey," he said gruffly. "You alive?" One of them stirred. She was younger, maybe late 20s, her dark hair escaping from a torn scarf. Her eyes fluttered open, wide with fear when they focused on him. "Please," she whispered. We couldn't go any farther." The second woman coughed weakly. She was older, early 40s perhaps, her face lined not just by age but by grief. She clutched a small bundle to her chest, a worn leather satchel as if it held her last claim to the world. Elias exhaled slowly. He had sworn, years ago, that he would live and die alone. The mountains were simpler that way. People brought noise, pain, memories. Still, he couldn't leave them here. "Shelters this way," he muttered. "If you can walk." They couldn't. Not really. So he lifted the younger one first, surprised by how light she was, then returned for the older woman. By the time he got them inside the cabin, his beard was crusted with ice and his shoulders burned. He laid them near the hearth, stoked the fire, and wrapped them in thick wool blankets. The cabin was small, one room with a loft, but warm, smelling of pine resin and wood smoke. The women watched him like frightened animals as he worked. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, not looking at them. "Storm'll pass by morning. You can go then." The younger woman swallowed. "Thank you," she said. "My name is Clara." The older woman nodded faintly. "I'm Margaret." Elias poured hot water into a kettle and added dried herbs. "Elias," he said, "drink this." Slowly. They obeyed, hands shaking. Silence settled, broken only by the wind screaming outside and the crackle of fire. After a while, color returned to their faces. Margaret was the first to speak. "We were on our way to the valley town. Heard there was work, cleaning, cooking, anything." Clara's eyes dropped. "Our husbands died last spring. Fever." Elias stiffened, something old and sharp twisting in his chest. He had heard that word too many times in his life. Fever had taken his mother, his sister, half the settlement where he'd grown up. "There was nothing left for us there," Margaret continued. "The farm was taken. Debts." The fire popped loudly. Elias cleared his throat. "You shouldn't have come this way." "We didn't know," Clara said softly. "The trader said it was shorter." He grunted. "Traders always said that." Night deepened. The storm worsened. Snow packed against the windows until the world outside disappeared completely. Elias fed the fire again, then sat on a stool near the door, arms crossed. Margaret hesitated, then asked, "Do you have a wife?" The question hit him harder than he expected. He stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. "I never had a wife," he said. His voice was flat, but something beneath it trembled. "Never wanted one." That wasn't entirely true, but it was easier than explaining. Clara exchanged a glance with Margaret. There was something unspoken there, a shared understanding born of loss and desperation. "We won't trouble you," Margaret said carefully. "We just need a place to rest. Tomorrow we'll be gone." Elias nodded. That was the plan. It had to be. They slept in shifts that night. Elias dozed lightly in his chair, waking at every sound. Memories crept in despite his efforts to push them away. His sister Anna, laughing as she braided flowers into her hair. Anna, burning with fever, begging him not to leave her alone. He clenched his fists until his nails bit into his palms. At dawn, the storm eased, leaving the world buried in white silence. Elias rose and opened the door. Snow lay chest deep in places. The trail was gone. Margaret joined him, wrapped in a blanket. "We can't leave today," she said quietly. He knew she was right. The mountain decided such things, not men. Days passed. 1 became 2, then 3. They shared what little food he had, rationing carefully. Clara helped where she could, sweeping, mending a tear in Elias's coat with surprisingly skilled hands. Margaret cooked stews from dried beans and salted meat, her movements efficient, practiced. The cabin felt different with them there. Warmer, not just from the fire. Laughter appeared, tentative at first, then more frequent. Elias found himself listening for their voices when he stepped outside to check traps. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks, Clara sat on the porch steps, watching the sky bleed orange into purple. Elias joined her, keeping a careful distance. "You're very alone up here," she said. "That's the point." She smiled faintly. "I used to think that too. After my husband died, I didn't want to see anyone. But silence gets loud," he snorted. "Mountains ain't silent." She laughed softly. The sound startled him with how much he liked it. That night, Margaret spoke of her husband, Thomas, a gentle man who sang while he worked. Clara spoke of Samuel, serious and kind, taken too soon. Their grief was raw, but sharing it seemed to lighten the weight. When they asked about his past, Elias hesitated. He hadn't spoken of it in years. "My sister died when I was 17, he said finally. "After that, my father drank himself into the ground. I left. Figured people were just things you lost." Margaret studied him with understanding eyes. "Loss doesn't mean the love was wrong." He said nothing. He had no answer for that. Another storm came, shorter but fierce. Clara slipped on the icy steps and twisted her ankle badly. Elias carried her inside, his jaw tight as he set the joint and bound it. She cried out, clutching his arm. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "Don't be," he said, more sharply than intended. His hands lingered a second longer than necessary before he pulled away. That night, as Clara slept fitfully, Margaret sat across from him. "You're a good man," she said. He scoffed. "You don't know me. I know what you do," she replied. "That's enough." The words stayed with him. Weeks passed before the trail cleared enough to travel safely. By then, something unspoken hung in the air, heavy and fragile. Elias avoided looking too long at Clara, avoided the warmth that bloomed in his chest when she smiled at him. He had built his life on solitude. Letting it crack terrified him. The morning they were set to leave, Margaret packed their few belongings. Clara moved slowly, leaning on a stick Elias had carved for her. "Thank you," she said, standing awkwardly near the door. "For everything." He nodded. "You'll find the valley. Stick to the river." Margaret hesitated. "You could come with us." He shook his head immediately. "This is my place." Clara bit her lip, then blurted, "We don't know what waits for us down there." "That's life," he said gruffly. They stepped outside. The air was sharp, bright. Snow glittered like broken glass. Elias watched as they started down the slope, two dark figures against the white. After a dozen steps, Margaret stopped. She turned back. "If you ever get tired of being alone," she called, "you know where the river leads." They disappeared into the trees. The cabin felt unbearably quiet after that. Elias moved through his routines like a man underwater. He hunted, chopped wood, repaired a leak in the roof. But everything felt hollow. Days later, he found Clara's scarf folded neatly on the table. She must have forgotten it. He picked it up, pressed it to his face, and inhaled. It smelled faintly of smoke and something softer, like wildflowers. That night, he dreamed of his sister, not sick, but smiling, standing beside two women he had come to know far too late. When he woke, his cheeks were wet. Spring crept in slowly, snow melted, streams swelled. One afternoon, Elias saw figures climbing the trail again. His heart hammered painfully until he recognized them. Clara walked more steadily now. Margaret waved. They reached the cabin, breathless but smiling. "We found work," Margaret said. "But it wasn't right." Clara stepped closer, eyes shining. "We talked about what you said. About people being things you lose. We don't believe that anymore." Elias swallowed. "You don't have to stay." "We know," Margaret said gently. "But we want to." Something inside him broke then, not painfully, but like ice thawing after a long winter. "I never had a wife," he said again, voice rough. "Never thought I could." Clara reached for his hand, hesitant. "We aren't asking you to be something you're not." Margaret nodded. "Just to let us share the shelter." He looked at the cabin, at the mountains, at the two women who had walked through a storm to find him. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like an empty stretch of snow. He stepped aside and held the door open.